It feels like every time you turn around, there's another headline designed to make you freak out, you know?
Yeah, I get it. It's so easy to get caught up in all that.
It really is. And you end up just hearing the same things over and over again, the same viewpoints.
Yeah,
It's like an echo chamber, and it's tough to break out of.
totally. It's the information overload, and it's all so emotionally charged.
Right. So for this deep dive, we're going back to yesterday, April 7th, 2025. We're going to look at the biggest stories of the day, but without all the hype.
We're going to examine how different sources covered the same events. We're talking balanced perspectives, aggregators like Ground News and AllSides, all that good stuff.
Our mission is to help you see beyond the headlines, cut through the spin, and really get to the heart of what happened.
Exactly. And as we go, think about your own news habits, okay? What are your go-to sources, and how do they shape what you see and believe? Are you actively seeking out different viewpoints or just sticking with what's comfortable?
All right, let's jump in. One of the biggest stories dominating the news yesterday was President Trump's trade tariffs and the massive impact they were having on, well, pretty much everyone.
Yeah, this was a huge one. We saw reports detailing President Trump imposing these sweeping tariffs on a whole bunch of trading partners, and there was a lot of talk about a potential 50% increase on the tariffs already hitting China.
It's kind of crazy when you lay it out, right? First you have the initial tariffs, then China comes back with their 34% retaliatory duties, and then President Trump throws down the gauntlet, basically saying, okay, if you don't back down, we're going to hit you with another 50%. I mean, the New York Post straight up called it a world war fee in their headline.
It was pretty dramatic. Even the Wall Street Journal, which is usually more, measured, called it market carnage and used a not so flattering photo of President Trump golfing.
Oh, wow. Subtle but effective. So all this is going on. And what happens? The markets, of course, go haywire. I mean, the Asian markets took a real beating. The Nikkei 225 in Japan, their equivalent of the Dow, plummeted. The SSE Composite Index in Shanghai, down. And the Hang Seng Index in Hong Kong, also way down.
Yeah, and it wasn't just Asia. European markets were down too, especially banking and defense. And the Australian ASX 200 and the South Korean Kospi both closed lower as well.
And then you have Wall Street, up, down, all over the place. It was a roller coaster ride all day long. The Dow ended up slightly down, the Nasdaq almost broke even, and the S&P 500 also slightly down.
And then you had Jim Cramer coming out and predicting a Black Monday market crash because of all this. That really didn't help calm things down.
Oh, no, definitely not. And then, to make things even wilder, a rumor started spreading on social media about a possible 90-day pause on the tariffs.
Right. And the market actually jumped on that, only for the White House to come out and deny it, calling it, wait for it, fake news.
The irony.
It really shows you how on edge everyone is. Any little whisper of a change in policy, and the market reacts instantly.
Okay, so I've got global markets freaking out.
Yeah.
What about the rest of the world? How did other countries react to all this tariff drama?
Well, you had a mix of responses. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen offered to negotiate with President Trump. She even proposed a zero-for-zero tariff deal on industrial goods. But she also made it clear that the EU was ready to retaliate with their own tariffs if things didn't go their way.
A little bit of carrot and stick.
Exactly. Then you have Taiwan's president, Le Ching-te. He was a bit more, shall we say, conciliatory. He said Taiwan wasn't planning to impose any retaliatory tariffs. In fact, he proposed a Taiwan-U.S. bilateral zero tariff deal and offered to increase Taiwanese imports and investments in the U.S., trying to smooth things over.
Interesting strategy. What about China? How did they respond?
They were not playing around. They flat out rejected President Trump's ultimatum. They said they were ready to match any further tariff hikes, basically calling his bluff. And get this, they even quoted President Reagan to criticize his protectionist policies.
Oh, wow.
Talk about throwing shade.
Yeah.
And even Japan's prime minister, he urged President Trump to reconsider just adding to the chorus of concern about these tariffs.
Okay, so we've got the international community weighing in, but what about folks back home? What were the reactions like domestically?
Well, there was a lot of anxiety, especially in the business world. You had some big names speaking out. Bill Ackman, the billionaire who actually supported President Trump in the past, he came out and urged him to delay those tariff deadlines. He even called it a potential self-induced economic nuclear winter.
That's a pretty intense image.
Yeah, it was a pretty dire warning, especially coming from someone within his own camp. And then you have Jamie Dimon, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase. He was worried about higher prices for consumers because of these tariffs.
Which makes sense, right? Tariffs mean businesses have to pay more, and eventually Those costs get passed on to us, the shoppers.
Exactly. And it wasn't just the big guys. Small business owners all over the country were worried too. They were looking at potential price increases for everything: fertilizer, construction materials, even things like tractor parts and imported wine from South Africa. Everything was going up.
And it wasn't just about the immediate price hikes. The Conference Board, that business research group, they said that CEO confidence, which had actually gone up after President Trump's election, was likely to drop because of all this uncertainty around trade.
Yeah, and politically, things weren't calm either. Senator Booker continued his hands-off protests against President Trump's second term, and there were other protests happening nationwide.
So, a lot of pushback.
Definitely. But interestingly enough, there was this one Republican strategist who said that House Republicans were probably going to give President Trump some time to see how this all played out. They're probably hoping that the tariffs either lead to some positive trade deals or give him more leverage in negotiations.
So, bit of a wait-and-see approach from some corners.
Yeah, but the underlying concern is still there. If these increased costs for businesses and ultimately consumers start to really hurt, it's going to affect how people view the economy. And that could have serious consequences come election time.
So, it's a bit of a gamble for the president, you could say. But what's his reasoning for all this? What's he saying to justify these tariffs?
His main argument is that these tariffs are like medicine, something the American economy needs to get better. He keeps saying America first, that this is all about putting American interests first.
And he's also saying that he can negotiate new trade deals while keeping these tariffs in place, right?
Sure. Yeah, which seems a little, I don't know, contradictory to some people. But he insists that because of these tariffs, lots of countries are coming to the table ready to make fair deals with the U.S. We'll have to wait and see how that plays out.
We will. Okay, let's move on to some of the other big news from yesterday. The Supreme Court had a busy day with a couple of rulings related to immigration.
Yeah, definitely. They made a 5-4 decision that allows the Trump administration to resume deporting Venezuelan migrants under this thing called the Alien Enemies Act. It's an old law from way back when, basically from wartime, and it lets them deport citizens of enemy nations.
Wow, bringing back old laws.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And the legal challenges to these deportations are going to be happening in Texas, so that's something to keep an eye on.
definitely. And then there was that case with the man from Maryland who was accidentally deported to El Salvador. Didn't Chief Justice Roberts step in on that one?
He did. He put a temporary hold on the deadline for the guy's return. There's some back and forth about whether the judge in the case actually had the authority to order his return in the first place.
And what's the administration saying about all this?
They're admitting it was a mistake, but they're saying they don't really have a way to get him back right now since he's not in U.S. custody anymore.
Complicated situation.
It is. It brings up some big questions about, what the government's responsibility is when they make mistakes like this.
Yeah, it does. And sticking with immigration news, we saw that officials in Maine filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration over a freeze on federal grant money. It seems like it's all tied to disagreements over policies on transgender athletes.
Yeah, that seems to be the root of it. And another big development, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, they're halting their partnerships with the federal government on a bunch of aid programs.
Why is that?
Apparently, it's because of funding cuts aimed at refugee resettlement. It's a pretty big deal, considering they've been working with the government on these programs for a long time.
A definite shift. And there was also a report from Truthout, the independent news site, about U.S. citizens being detained during mass deportation operations.
Yeah, that's pretty disturbing. It raises some serious concerns about due process and the possibility of more errors happening in these large-scale actions.
It does. Let's switch gears and talk about the conflict in Gaza. Yesterday, there were more reports and casualties, including another tragic incident involving an Israeli airstrike.
Yeah, this time it hit near a charity kitchen, and at least 7 people were killed. Then there was another airstrike that hit a media tent outside of Nasser Hospital, killing a journalist and another person and injuring others.
It seems like the situation there just keeps escalating.
It does. The Israeli military said they were targeting a Hamas militant who is pretending to be a journalist, but the international community is calling for an independent investigation, particularly into the killing of Palestinian medics. There's a lot of concern about civilian casualties.
Makes sense. And on top of that, there were protests in Jerusalem calling for the release of hostages being held in Gaza. People are worried that if the fighting intensifies, those hostages are going to be in even more danger.
Yeah, it's a really tense situation all around. Meanwhile, there was some news coming out of Iran. President Trump announced plans for direct, high-level talks with Tehran. He said the goal is to get a stronger agreement than the 2015 nuclear deal,
Trying again, huh?
apparently. But as of yesterday, there was no word from Tehran about whether they're on board with this. President Trump also issued a warning, just in case the talks don't work out. He said there would be consequences, and he didn't rule out military action. He made it very clear that Iran can't be allowed to have nuclear weapons.
Sounds like he's playing hardball.
He definitely is. Okay, let's switch to some domestic news. We've got Kentucky dealing with the aftermath of some major flooding.
Yeah, I saw that. How bad is it?
Well, rivers surged, and now everyone's watching and waiting for the water to recede so they can start cleaning up and rebuilding.
Hopefully they can get some relief soon.
I hope so. And then there's RFK Jr. He's saying he's going to tell the CDC to stop recommending fluoride in drinking water.
Really? What?
Well, he says there are concerns about its safety, and the EPA is actually reviewing new scientific information on it.
Interesting. And this is completely unrelated, but I saw that a former FDA official, the one who's in charge of vaccines, said he was basically forced out after he refused to give RFK Jr.'s team unrestricted access to vaccine safety data.
Yeah, he was worried they might misuse the information. Said there were trust issues.
Okay. On a lighter note, the LA Dodgers went to the White House yesterday to celebrate their World Series win.
Yeah, and President Trump, being President Trump, used the opportunity to brag about how egg prices are down. He also refused to introduce some senators he's apparently not a fan of.
Typical.
Pretty much. Some other quick hits. Actor Jay North, who played Dennis the Menace on TV, passed away at 73. And in the world of hockey, Alex Ovechkin, the Washington Capitals star, broke Wayne Gretzky's all-time NHL goal-scoring record. Pretty amazing feat.
It is. Oh, and I wanted to mention that PBS NewsHour did a series called Taiwan Risk and Resistance about Taiwan's preparations for a possible invasion by China. Sounds really interesting.
Yeah, and apparently the Taiwanese government even supported a TV series called 0 Day to raise awareness about the whole situation.
Wow, so they're really taking it seriously.
Yeah, it seems like it.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, but let's talk about something really important. We've seen how the same story can be presented in so many different ways, depending on who's telling it. How can we, as news consumers, navigate this and make sure we're getting a balanced view?
That's the million-dollar question, right? One thing that can help is being aware of potential bias in your news sources. Tools like the media bias chart from Ad Fontes Media can be super helpful for that. They break down the reliability and bias of different outlets.
Yeah, I've used that before. It's really eye-opening.
Right, and then you have sites like AllSides, which try to present multiple perspectives on the same stories, so you're not just getting one side of the story.
Right.
And I saw on Reddit, on the Source Interest Forum, actually, people were talking about the new AllSides media bias chart. Apparently, it sparked some interesting debates about where certain outlets fall on the spectrum.
That makes sense. It's not always clear-cut.
It's not. There was a Pew Research Center study that found that many people struggle to distinguish between factual statements and opinions in the news.
Yeah, it's easy to get those mixed up sometimes, especially when things are presented in a certain way.
Exactly. But the study also found that people who are more politically aware or have better digital literacy skills, and those who trust news media more, they're better at telling the difference.
So the more informed you are, the better equipped you are to spot bias and misinformation.
Exactly. And there's this concept called sane washing that I read about in the Columbia Journalism Review. And it's basically when journalists present things, even if they're kind of crazy ideas, in a way that makes them seem more rational than they actually are.
So even with seemingly objective reporting, there can still be subtle ways that bias creeps in.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to look beyond the surface, Try using apps like Ground News, which show you how the same story is covered by outlets with different leanings. That can help you see those different framings.
I like that. And I've also heard of Media Bias Fact Check. It's another site that rates the bias and factual reporting of different sources.
Yeah, that was good too. And going back to the AllSides chart, there were some disagreements about where to place certain outlets like CNN, Jacobin, The Hill, even places like the Epoch Times, the AP, Christian Science Monitor, and NPR. It shows you that even the concept of center or unbiased is up for debate.
It really is. And honestly, I don't think there's such a thing as a completely unbiased source. The key is to be aware of those biases and to get your news from a variety of sources. That way, you're less likely to get stuck in an echo chamber.
I totally agree. And I think one thing that's important to remember is that news isn't always meant to be like super in-depth. It's designed to give you the highlights, but sometimes you need to dig deeper. Someone on Reddit actually made a great point about this. They said that reading books can be a great way to get a more nuanced understanding of complex issues.
That's a really good point. And it's not just about seeking out different viewpoints, but also about remembering that facts don't always equal the whole truth.
Right. The way those facts are selected and presented, that's where bias can really come into play.
So to wrap things up, even just looking at one day's worth of news, April 7th, 2025, it's clear that there's so much going on, so many perspectives to consider. It can be overwhelming.
It really is. But the bottom line is we all need to be more active and discerning news consumers. Don't just passively absorb what's thrown at you. Be skeptical, ask questions, and seek out diverse sources.
Exactly. And think about the stories we've discussed today. How did your usual sources cover them? What did they emphasize and what did they leave out?
In this age of information overload, it's more important than ever to be aware of how information is being shaped and to take responsibility for forming our own well-rounded understanding of the world. It's a challenge, but it's worth it.
Couldn't agree more.